I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we'll discuss the latest tactical and strategic news from Ukraine. We hear what life was like for ordinary Ukrainians living under Russian occupation, and we answer your questions on the conflict.
This hideous and barbaric venture of Vladimir Putin must end in failure.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
Every weekday afternoon, I sit down with leading journalists from the Telegraph's London newsroom and our teams reporting on the ground to bring you the latest news and analysis on the war in Ukraine. It's April 7th, day 43, and today I'm joined by Dominic Nicholls, the Telegraph's Defence and Security Editor, Deputy Foreign Editor Theo Mers, and Assistant Comment Editor Francis Dearnley. I started by asking Dom Nicholls for the latest updates from the front line.
Yeah, hi David, hi everybody. So more shelling in the Donbass as the focus shifts to the east of the country. Contested areas still around Sumy and Kharkiv in the sort of northeast. It seems clear now from the north of Kyiv and up around the very north of the country, around Chernihiv. Although the Ukrainian MP for Chernihiv, Lesia Vasilenko, said that she's recommending people don't go back to their homes in Chernihiv, warning of landmines and various other booby traps that have been left by the withdrawing Russian forces. So again, generally quiet in terms of armoured offensive action, but relying on the artillery and missile strikes still.
And one issue for Ukraine seems to be supplies. Ukraine has said it knows how to win the war against Russia and has called on NATO nations to provide it with more weapons. Can we talk about that a little bit? What are they asking for, and what does this show us about the state of Ukraine's army right now?
This came from the NATO meeting that's in Brussels yesterday and finishes today. The Ukrainian Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba has been there, and he addressed NATO and said, "My agenda is simple. It's weapons, weapons, weapons." So he's making very clear that that they are feeling that Ukraine feels like it can win this. That's what the White House press spokesman said yesterday. So they are demonstrating the ability to win. All they need now is to be supplied. And actually, interestingly, yesterday the US Congress voted to enact a Lend-Lease Act, which we may remember from the Second World War, as a way of expediting kit to a country in question without having to go through all the sort of usual foreign military sales bobbins and all that kind of stuff. So yes, it's sort of moving into, if not attritional, then industrial warfare. Who can get the most stuff into the area of battle the fastest? And in that, Ukraine are calling for tanks, armour, artillery, and the counter-battery stuff and counter-battery fire ability, loitering munitions, precision-guided munitions, in order to be able to take on not only the Russian artillery groups that are still pulverising Ukrainian civilian areas, but also if the focus of the next fight is going to be in the Donbass, and we'll talk about why that's going to come into sharp focus in the next few weeks, in a little while, I think. But if going back to that more, air quotes, conventional battle, then it's combined arms equipment. It's tanks working with infantry, working with precision guided munitions from artillery units, and so on and so forth, all backed up by a robust logistic plan. And we've seen Russia fall foul of that in the first few weeks of the war. So yes, it's now moving into a very industrial focus. Not that we're suggesting Ukraine will physically build stuff itself now. It's how much stuff can you get in there quickly? How many capabilities can Western forces push into Ukraine and train the crews and the maintainers as well? It's not just having the stuff; it's being able to keep it going. That's where the focus is now.
Francis Dearnley.
If I could just build on what Dom has just said, I think strategically this is a significant shift, of course. Originally, when this conflict began, part of the reasons why the Ukrainians have been able to fight so effectively was they are fighting a defensive war, and it's much easier to defend than to attack. The primary reason why it has become now so essential for tanks to be being delivered to Ukraine, and from the perspective of the Ukrainians, is that infantry is not enough when you're on the attack, and clearly now they are hoping to drive the Russian forces further out of Ukraine. we know that the Czechs have already given tanks, but the reason why I think this is so distressing for Zelensky is that there are numerous examples of tanks, particularly in Germany, that are due to be scrapped, that are literally sitting there and which could be being sent to the front lines of Ukraine at any time. And part of the reason why that didn't take place was because of this fear of it being perceived by Putin, by Russia, as an escalation. But it would seem that the ground is shifting on that. Just one other thought on the military situation. I think it's also significant that nobody seems to be commenting on the fact that the weather is now starting to change as we move into spring. That winter weather, which makes using tanks and other heavy warfare weaponry challenging to use. When you've got frozen roads and things, it's even more challenging when those roads turn to quagmires. And furthermore, when one is fighting guerrilla-style tactics, such as those being deployed by the Ukrainians, when you have foliage, when you have places in which to hide and be able to snipe from more easily, which they will have in the coming weeks, this again will play, I would argue, in more favourably to the Ukrainians than to the Russians. But I'm sure Dom has a few more thoughts on that. But yes, as I say, the shift from winter to spring, I think, is something that may well play into this quite significantly.
Well, before that, just quickly, Theo, would you like to come in on any of this? There are a few other updates I think we should talk about. There's a video verified by the New York Times, which appears to be a war crime by Ukrainian soldiers. And there's also an update from Mariupol, the accusations that Russia is using mobile crematoriums. Could you talk to these two stories?
Yes, well, we've seen that this video, which does show Ukrainian soldiers, a very graphic video that shows Ukrainian soldiers killing Russian prisoners of war, which would constitute a war crime. And also, as you say, in Mariupol, this order to fire on civilians. We've also seen that in Bucha, where there was the massacre that was uncovered last week or at the start of this week. More audio's been released today through the German media with very similar instructions being given from Russian commanders to open fire on non-combatants, which obviously is a war crime as well. And the other update from today and from the last 2 days really is that more and more of these areas that were occupied by Russia are now back, at least temporarily, under Ukrainian control, and that means journalists are able to go there and get the story out of what has been going on. Obviously, we know about Bucha already, the massacre there, the war crimes, and now we're seeing that repeated in other areas: mass graves, kidnapping, reports of summary executions, a very, very grim picture unfolding or emerging of life under this Russian occupation. And one of our correspondents in Ukraine, who I've just been speaking to, Danielle Sheridan, is in Chernihiv today and has been able to see what it's like opening up now. And she was telling me that it's the first day that they've had electricity there in a month, and everyone is running to charge their mobile phones to be able to speak with family and friends in other parts of Ukraine to find out how they are, whether they're alive or dead. So it's a really emotional time in those places, and a really grim picture that is coming out of there.
In today's Telegraph, there's a story talking about how in the Russian High Command they're looking for big victories before May the 9th. Why is this date important, and what might their push, and potentially this is where we bring in what Dom mentioned earlier about the importance of the Donbass and the move towards the Donbass, but why May the 9th, Theo? What's the importance of that date?
Well, May the 9th is Victory Day in Russia. It's a celebration of its victory over Nazi Germany, and in Moscow and actually in cities all across the country, they have military parades. So Moscow is obviously the most significant, and they will often do some significant saber rattling, bring out the latest weaponry to for a parade through the streets, as well as many soldiers. And it's a celebration that's become increasingly important over the last 2 decades of Putin's rule. When he came into power, it wasn't such a massive event in Russia. And the reason why it's become more and more important is it's part of his policy or aim of making Russia great again and focusing on these victorious moments in its history rather than the many difficult or complicated moments in its history, and highlighting this idea or forcing this idea on people. You're not allowed to question it legally, that Russia essentially saved the world with its battle against Nazism, which obviously the Soviet Union played a huge role in that, and had the largest losses of any country in the conflict. But it's got to a point now where you're not allowed to question anything around the official narrative, and obviously there are very questionable elements in how the Soviet Union related to Nazi Germany. Obviously, the non-aggression pact that kept the Soviet Union out of the war for the first couple of years divided up Europe into spheres of influence between Germany and the Soviet Union. So it's become this event which is not questioned and is not critically examined, and it's an increasingly totalitarian focal point of Russian culture. And for that reason, Putin is really going to want to have another victory that he is able to tack on to the Victory Day celebrations this year. So it may see an increased push in hostilities in Ukraine.
Dom and Francis, I don't know if you want to add to that. What might this mean for the Russian redeployment and next assault?
Yeah, so we had a brief yesterday from a Western official, a tactical update there. He was saying that the assessment is that of the 125 Russian battalion tactical groups that went into Ukraine, 29 of them are now not combat effective. That's the military term, i.e. they've been smashed up. They cannot get back in the fight now. They need to be either completely repaired themselves or blobbed together with other units to have any kind of effect. So that's, it's almost a quarter of the force. That's a massive hit that Russia has taken there. And as we mentioned yesterday, this reconstitution effort in Belarus, which reconstitution is regenerating the people and the equipment that's broken, and also reorganizing the structures and the units and formations that you want to fight with, is a massive undertaking. And the assessment is, again, from the official, the figure that was quoted from the White House of 3 to 4 weeks. They agreed with that. So you've got this huge Russian effort in Belarus to fix itself, fix the army that's broken up there. Huge proportion of the total number of troops that went in, and it's going to take 3 or 4 weeks. Well, May the 9th is just over 4 weeks' time from now. So if Putin wants this victory in the Donbass to claim something, or as Russia would have it, that's been the whole plan all along. But regardless, to have this victory in a little over 4 weeks' time, when you've got a huge proportion of your force that is broken and is going to take 3 or 4 weeks to get back on its feet, let alone travel to the area and then fight, it's a huge undertaking. So either you're left with the political imperative, possibly from Putin, to say, well, get in there, generals. This is what need to happen. And if the senior military leadership are able to turn around and say truth to power and say, well, we can't do it. We need longer. That would be interesting. And there's been no evidence of that so far, because they weren't able to do that in the first few weeks of the war. So if there is resistance, that might speak of a more professional army and a more confident army that's able to say truth to power. But if there's a sudden rush, if over the next few days and into the next week or two, we see Russia throwing itself at the Donbass, that will be very interesting in itself, because that will speak of a panic to get something done quickly, of a continued inability to speak truth to power and say we're just not ready, and they will not be in a shape to do so. So perversely and bizarrely, operations in the Donbass now, if we were to say wake up tomorrow to see headlines of Russia launches massive attack into the Donbass, that might perversely actually be quite a good thing from the Ukrainian point of view, because those forces will be under-equipped. They are still traveling in single convoys along roads and just getting hit by Ukrainian anti-tank squads. So they've not adjusted their tactics. If they go quickly, they're probably going to come unstuck again. But there is this political imperative, we think, from Putin to get something by May the 9th. So it's going to be a very, very interesting next couple of weeks to see what happens. And of course, on the Ukrainian side, there's the rush to get equipment into the area. Any Russian action in the Donbass to envelop sort of south from Kharkiv and north from Mariupol, you could look at it as, well, that's going to squeeze those 10 brigades of Ukrainian troops in the Donbass. But of course, every circle has an outer edge as well, and any enveloping action to try and squeeze the Donbass has got a very exposed flank from the Dnipro area and from the west of the country. So, this is by no means a given that even if Russia get there in any numbers, that they're going to be able to do something. But the sooner they do something would probably be better for Ukraine. I think that would speak a lot of quite where that conversation is between the senior leadership, military leadership and Putin now, about whether or not they can resist this political pressure to get something done by May the 9th, and actually are able to say we need time to reconstitute ourselves. There's been no evidence of that so far, but it's certainly one that will speak volumes.
Thanks very much, Dom. Before we talk about your article on the Ukrainian and Russian tank battle, which is absolutely fascinating, and I'd advise everyone to go to the Telegraph website and read it, because Dom provides a deep look at the tactics and the thinking behind what's actually going on in this extraordinary piece of footage from Ukraine. I think there's a couple of diplomatic things we need to talk about quickly. So there's been lots of movement in Brussels on Russian energy imports. Francis.
Yes, there's been a lot of movement in the last few days and hours, indeed, about from within the European Parliament and from within Europe generally. And as it will come as no surprise, viewing the horrific atrocities that have taken place or have been discovered in recent days, that the European political elite has decided that actually now, if there's ever going to be a moment to have a full-scale embargo on Russian gas and oil, that it is this where they can rally their own people behind it. It is this moment. There was a vote today in the European Parliament that is urging countries to go for a full embargo, but that is not yet. It's not been completely validated. It's not going to happen overnight, but this is showing a very much a consensus that there is a desire to do that. More broadly on this point of negotiations, we've obviously been following very closely the negotiations that are taking place in Turkey between the Russians and the Ukrainians. And in the same way that the atrocities have had an impact on the energy debate within Europe, it's also had a significant, we hear, effect on the talks there. Effectively, it seems that it's derailed those peace talks quite significantly. That's a more or less a quotation from Erdogan's top advisor. And we're also hearing that Russia want sanctions relief as part of any potential deal. That seems increasingly unlikely given the state of things as they currently are. So it would appear that at least as far as negotiations and the political manoeuvrings are concerned, that things are becoming increasingly difficult for Russia, as we've been predicting on this podcast for several weeks now.
We'll return to our panel in a bit. On the front page of today's Daily Telegraph is our reporter Danielle Sheridan's dispatch from the recently recaptured towns of Andrivka and Lipivka. Danielle spoke to residents who lived under Russian military occupation. These are their stories. Can we start with Tatiana Oleksienko?
Tatiana's story was really devastating, and it is what made the front page today. So she lives in a town called Andrivka, which is about a 2.5 hour drive from Kyiv. So the town was occupied by Russians, and she decided to go seek refuge in a neighbour's cellar along with her daughter, her granddaughter, and in total there were 10 people because she was there with some neighbours as well. But food started to run low, so she went above ground to go in search of food. She knew she had some products in her own cellar at home, and when she went to retrieve these products, she saw that her home had actually been overtaken by the Russians. They basically moved in, and she saw that they were digging around in her back garden. So she went to ask them, which I think is quite brave in itself, because we know that Russians have been indiscriminately killing civilians. So to even take it upon yourself to approach the soldiers, and she did, and she said that they started digging in her garden with shovels, and then they brought in a tractor, and she asked them, "What are you doing?" And they explained to her that they had been instructed to dig a grave, and it would be for her and her fellow villagers. And she was understandably really shaken, telling me this, like physically shaking. She was very emotional. By the time we finished speaking, she was just sobbing. She just said that once upon a time her garden had been a beautiful place. It had cherry trees, apricot trees, apple trees, and all of them have been ripped up from the ground in order for the Russians to bring this tractor over to start digging a massive pit. And it's clear evidence of war crimes. What they were intending to do was to perform genocide, to kill a number of civilians and to hide the evidence inside a mass grave. And the only reason they didn't succeed is because the Ukrainian forces managed to come in and liberate the village, which in itself is quite challenging for Tatiana to get her head around, because it's only such a stroke of luck that she wasn't murdered because of the Ukrainian forces coming to their rescue. And I think that's something she's having to weigh up now, and why it's so traumatic is that kind of knowledge that you very nearly almost die, like a near-death experience, I suppose.
You also spoke to Vitaly Cherkasov, a member of Andrivka's village council, and he told you a little bit about the experience of women and children during the occupation. What did he say?
It was through this conversation with Vitaly that we ended up learning about Tatiana's back garden. He mentioned that the school over the road from where he lived had been occupied by the Russians, and they had essentially held a number of women and children hostage in the school so that the Ukrainians wouldn't fire at them. He said that he had heard that whilst keeping these women and children as hostages, they'd raped them. That hasn't been verified, not a lot of things have been verified, but that is what he had heard himself. And a number of villagers had heard this. I think just the barbaric treatment of civilians is what is so difficult to get one's head around, because, in war, it should be the civilians that are attacked. They should be left alone, and yet they were just indiscriminately targeting them and torturing them and children as well, which is so sad, knowing that they didn't stop at anyone.
And there was some resistance and determination to rebuild. You spoke to a woman called Olha who decided who said to you that she would not leave and she would rebuild. What did she say? How is she going to do that?
She was so remarkable. She came out to speak to me and brought with her a portrait of her son, who's currently fighting on behalf of the Ukrainians. And she was stoical. Her entire house is rubble. I went inside with her to look. There is a sort of frame that still exists. You can make out what part of the house might have looked like, but everything is, you literally walk over chunks of brick as you pass through what was once her home. I'm not even sure where she's sleeping. There's nothing in there. She had a car that was parked in her garage and it's a burnt shell. But despite all of this, she is not going to leave the town. She said that if she were to do that, it's like the Russians win all over again. So she is determined to rebuild. And she says she doesn't care how long it takes. She will make this plot of land her home again. And I think that kind of resilience is so symbolic of the Ukrainian spirit. You know, when this war even began, everyone said, well, the Ukrainians are never going to win because of, I think I said it, the Russian army, the Russian military is just going to swamp them. How can they possibly compete? And yet they have, and they've won in some areas. It was really encouraging to hear her still have hope despite all this devastation. And that is something that does permeate throughout my reporting. Going back to Tatiana, who had the grave dug in her back garden, when we finished speaking and when I'd managed to calm her down, because getting her to talk about everything was very distressing, and she was hysterical by the end of the interview, she then invited me back. She said, please, in peacetime, come be my guest. And it shows that she is still looking for what the future holds, and despite all the trauma that they've gone through, there's still positive days ahead, and that's really remarkable and something nice to take away from all of this.
Turning to Lipivka, which was also under Russian occupation, recently liberated, you write that a grave containing the bodies of 6 Ukrainian fighters was opened, and there was a rather remarkable story about an exchange with Russian troops and then the exhumation of the bodies to the families. What happened?
Fighting broke out between Russian and Ukrainian soldiers, and 6 were killed. I think it was around the 11th of March. And a woman called Tonya, who lived in the village, who lives in the village, went and approached the soldiers with her neighbour and said, please don't shoot, we're civilians. Would you mind if we repatriated our fallen men so that we can give them a proper burial? Please don't shoot at us if we go and do this. Can we have your agreement? And to their surprise, the Russian soldiers agreed to let them do this. And, you know, by that courageous act, they were able to go and collect the bodies of these 6 soldiers and take them to a safe place, as it were. They created a communal grave in the back of a church. And when we drove to Lipivka yesterday, the bodies were being exhumed, and they were all still in their military fatigues. And a lot of people had turned up to, I suppose, pay their respects, including the father of one of the soldiers, a 24-year-old man. And it was really moving to see them, you know, the friends and families kind of hugging each other, and then their bodies being so carefully placed into these white body bags. They were lined up in a row beside the church and then put into an ambulance. And we spoke to the father of one of the boys, and he was just really upset. And I said to him at the end, how do you feel? And he just looked at me and said, how do you think I feel? And I thought, yeah, I can't imagine. It's kind of one of those stories where something great came out of it in the sense that they were able to rescue these bodies and preserve them and give them a decent burial. But ultimately, why were they even having to fight in the first place? You know, this whole Russian invasion, what was it for?
With the Russian retreat and the Ukrainian advance and the fact that they've recaptured these towns, people have moved back. People have gone back to their old homes. And you spoke, I believe, to a man called Valery Timchuk, who had fled Lipivka, and now he's returned. What did he find?
I've said this before. A number of towns remind me of suburban towns in the UK, from the decor inside to the very aesthetic of the home. And his home was no different. And he had obviously spent a lot of money doing his home up and taken great pride in it. And it looked like a drug den. There was awful graffiti scrawled on the wall of his garage door, which said "boom." This was in Russian, "boom." Then it said, "Sorry, we didn't want to, but you made us do it," effectively. You know, playing into this whole neo-Nazi diatribe. His house was just torn apart, turned upside down. He told me all his gold had been stolen, all his valuables. If you went into the kitchen, cupboards were smashed, broken glass absolutely everywhere. Fires had been lit on top of his bed, so the mattress was completely burnt through. Curtain rails were hanging from the ceiling. Mirrors had been smashed. They'd obviously, when I say turn the place upside down, looking for things, because every single cupboard and shelf that had once contained clothes, all of those items were just splayed on the floor. There was rubbish, beer bottles, cigarette butts. It was awful. It smelt really bad. And but in the lounge, the chandelier light that he had still hung perfectly intact. And you know, you could see the kind of style of his sofas that he'd chosen. And that's what I mean about being able to see how someone had taken pride in their home and then to have it just destroyed. He also had been shot. He'd been hit on his face. He had 3 bullet wounds and he'd managed to survive. So he's really been through it. And he was just saying, I don't even know where to begin. He's not living there right now. It's uninhabitable. But he intends to come back and forth to try and get it back into a livable state. But it's going to require a massive cleanup operation because of the state that they left it in.
The final person to bring up, I think, at the end of your report, 87-year-old Klavdia Voskoboynikova, who did stay behind in occupied Korolivka, and she stayed behind to feed the dogs. What was her story?
She was a very sweet old woman, and she told me that this was her home and she wasn't going to be kicked out of it by anyone. She has 2 children, a son and a daughter, and they tried to evacuate her and she wouldn't go anywhere. The reason why she ended up feeding these abandoned dogs is because most people did flee the village and they left behind their animals in doing so. So she's become the kind of owner of a number of dogs that were very sweet. But it was so sad going and talking to her because her house was absolutely freezing. It was colder inside her small cottage than it was outdoors, and it wasn't warm yesterday. She has no electricity, no gas, so no heating. Every single one of her windows has been blown out, so it's just cold air coming through. There are curtains, but the cold air makes its way through, and just the house felt like a chiller. And people are bringing her food, you know, dried goods and whatnot, but obviously she doesn't have any way of cooking anything other than eating canned goods. And there was just something about, I asked her what she did with her days, And obviously anything she does has to work around daylight hours because there's no way of reading a book or watching TV because she doesn't have a light to read and she doesn't have electricity to watch television. So she just kind of explained that she doesn't really do anything in the evenings, and eventually night comes and then it's morning and she starts all over again. And I just felt it was such a kind of sad existence right now. It was a real insight yesterday into how this war has affected the individual civilians. What infuriates me is seeing people still denying that Russia is committing these atrocities. I've already been tweeted by a number of people today claiming that it's lies what I'm reporting. And this journalism is so integral if we're to prove what atrocities, what genocide, what war crimes Putin is committing. And I think I saw with my own eyes a grave that had been dug in a woman's back garden to bury civilians. That is a war crime. They just didn't succeed in following it through. Yesterday was really hard. When you're seeing people sobbing, it's really hard not to be moved because they're people, and you'd have to be a psychopath, I think, to not feel sadness when someone's stood there just crying so intensely. But I suppose that's why you just have to keep doing what we do and reporting their stories. And I'm so grateful that the Telegraph put it on the front page because it shows it's harrowing, and it shows how important it is to be documented. As for myself, I'm just really grateful that the villagers are willing to talk and still share their experience, because it's obviously traumatic to have to relive it, and it's very kind of them to be willing to talk to the media.
Dom Nichols, you've written this analysis of a drone video of a lone Ukrainian tank taking on an entire Russian armoured vehicle convoy. It's on the Telegraph website. You can read it yourself if you're listening. There's lots of video, there's lots of analysis. What's going on? Why does it matter? What does it show us about the two armies?
So this incident happened on March 31st on the road about 40 k's east of Kyiv. There's a large Russian column, mainly BTR, the Brony transporter, the people carriers, armoured personnel carriers, but with some tanks in amongst the convoy, moving along looks like a paved road, but it's certainly a main roadway. And then the drone footage shows a single Ukrainian T-64 tank taking them on. Now we've got to be very careful about verifying what we're seeing and not reading too much into it, because we don't get a good view, but we can't see everything. So when we say lone Ukrainian tank, that's because that's all we can see, and those are the rounds that we can see being fired are only from that vehicle. But it looks like, in military terms, a classic sort of meeting engagement, which is basically two forces up, don't know the other one's there, and then suddenly are surprised to find the other one. And in British Army teaching, a meeting engagement, it's the side that gets the best situational awareness, works out what the hell's going on, decides what they're going to do, and then enacts that plan quicker will win generally, because it's a sudden shock, and the side that can maneuver quickest and get into a position to do something will generally have the initiative and will win. Of course, there's a big numbers part to that, and in this episode there are, about 20 vehicles we can see, and the column could be longer. It all depends on we only get a couple of minutes worth of video, and against one tank. But we see a T-64 tank move into position very quickly, quite a good position actually, in amongst some buildings. So it's covered from view and fire from the road. No overhead protection, so the crew's obviously got no time to think, well, have the Russians got any airborne assets, drones, or anything else that could spot them from above? They haven't got time to think about that. They've just got to get into a position quickly and engage. And one of the reasons that I've assessed that it was a meeting engagement is the fact that the tank, the Ukrainian T-64, first fires over its right side, so it gets into position and immediately opens fire. Now, as I've said before, the majority of the armour on a tank is in the frontal sort of 60-degree arc. If you're standing on the top of a turret and you hold your arms out from sort of 10 to 2, that's where the armour is, on the front of the turret, the front of the tank, the very front of the flanks of the tank. So the sides, the belly, the top, and the rear are exposed with very little armour. So if you're going to attack something, you want to have your main armour facing the enemy. So the fact that this tank is able to or gets into position and fires over the side indicates to me that it was decided to be done in haste. Also, that first round misses. It fires about 150 meters against vehicles on the road, misses them, and explodes to the rear in some wood on the other side of the road. That's quite telling as well. The fact that we see an explosion suggests that it's using high explosive shell. I know this might sound obvious, but there are basically two types of round that a tank would fire. Two main types. So a high explosive shell, which is as I suggest, it's full of explosive. It will cause a great big bang. You use that against soft-skinned vehicles, against personnel, against bunkers, buildings, etc., etc. An anti-tank round is completely different. An anti-tank round that is fired by a tank is just a long dart, about a foot long, a couple of inches in diameter, and they are incredibly dense material. In the West, we used to use depleted uranium. That's going out of favour, but you need something incredibly strong to withstand the impact, basically, of hitting a tank. And the idea with those things is that they perforate the tank. They go in one side and come out the other. And they're going so fast, above 1,500 meters a second, so almost a mile a second, they enter what's called the hydrodynamic regime. And that is that the chemical properties, and please do at me on this, please do kind of go onto it, because this is what I remember from my tank days, and most of that went straight over my head. But what I do remember is the hydrodynamic regime is when the chemicals of the metals, because of the force, the kinetic energy that's imparted into that dart at 1,500 meters a second, the metals act basically like water, and the super dense dart is able to go through the metal armament of the tank, through, into, and out the other side. And it's going so fast, it's just dragging, a bit like the sort of wake in when you're driving along, or you're flying along, or what have you. The wake behind it just drags all the rubbish from the outside and from the inside of the tank turret into the turret and through the other side. So the inside, the behind armor effect, as the military term is, it's basically like setting off a shotgun inside the turret, or like a grenade going off. There's just stuff going everywhere. So the crew are probably killed by that. What also happens is, because the dart's going so fast, it increases the pressure. There's a big pressure wave, which increases the temperature, and that sudden increase, rapid increase in temperature, can set off any charges inside the tank that's just been hit. So it will suddenly flare up. All the explosive charges in that turret will suddenly go up, and that's why we see the Russian tank turret throwing contest that we've been witnessing for the last few weeks. You see these turrets being blown off and hurled across tens of meters on occasion, and landing elsewhere. It's because the explosive charges inside the tank itself, rather than the thing that's hit it, have all gone off. So, sorry, a long way of saying that dart does not have any explosive charge in it itself. It's just a really, really heavy, dense metal dart going through a tank. So there are no explosions, which is why we can tell that the T-64 here is firing high explosive shells. It then fires again, manages to hit a BTR-82, a tank, an armoured personnel carrier. Could have up to about 10 people inside, possibly. That vehicle starts burning. We then see a number of things happening. So the convoy pushes on. One of the standard drills would be to push through the area of contact. If you don't think you're going into a wider ambush and you've just passed the stopping group, and you're about to wade into the range of the killing group, you just keep going, just get out of the contact zone as quickly as possible. So the majority of the vehicles do that. Some vehicles stop to the rear of the column, and infantry get out and start moving through to the area of where they think the firing is coming from. Other BTRs start laying down fire into likely areas of where they think the enemy might be firing at them, the Ukrainian tank might be firing at them from. The first few shots are wildly inaccurate, but they're not aimed shots. You're just trying to lay down fire. And then eventually they do, after a couple of seconds, the T-64 fires another round, which again misses. But by then, it kicks up so much dust and it actually collapses part of the building next to it. So the Russian BTR crews can then see where the firing is coming from. So they start laying down pretty accurate fire, although it doesn't look as if anything actually hits the T-64. Also, meanwhile, to about 75 meters to the left of the tank, the T-64, the Russian infantry have got their bearings. They've dismounted. They've got shoulder-launched anti-tank missiles, and they fire one round off. But as I said at the start, the T-64 has sighted itself pretty well. And even though the Russian soldier can clearly see the tank, the missile, they don't just fire. They don't just go down like a straight sort of laser beam. They do wobble around a little bit until they come under control, and it's quite a close contact. So that the missile just sort of wobbles slightly a couple of meters to one side and hits a building. So it doesn't actually hit the tank. That is where the video ends. So we don't know if the T-64 is destroyed, or if it manages to get out of there, or how many other Russian vehicles are engaged. So we don't know. So this is just one minor. Sorry, no, I shouldn't say minor. It was very serious, obviously, but it was a tactical action, a very small, very low-level tactical action in one corner of Ukraine, taking place over a couple of minutes. But it just speaks of the gritty nature of this war, because there must have been thousands of these types of actions if 29 Russian battalion tactical groups have been wiped out. I mean, this is what this war is. It's close. I mean, a tank range is 2 kilometers planning range. No problem at all. That's what you'd expect to be able to engage another vehicle at. So this is about 150 meters. This is like a quick draw for tanks. So it does speak of the desperate and fierce defense that the Ukraine forces have put up to just see an opportunity, get into the best position they can, and start opening up and take their chances, basically. It also speaks of Russia still using these roads, as the Western official brief yesterday. They're still using roads. They've got no flank protection until they have to stop and debus, get the infantry out to cover the flanks to go and interdict or go and stop the threat. They've got no air cover. So we're now 6-7 weeks into the war, and they're doing the same things that they were in the very first few days. So I'd caution against reading too much into it about grand tactics, but it is interesting that they're still doing the same things, and it speaks of as I say, that Ukrainian resistance, the having a go, seeing an opportunity, putting themselves in a position against overwhelming odds. We don't know what happened, but I'd be very surprised if the T-64 got out of there. And it's amazing to see. We don't get to see this very often unless you're there. So it is quite telling. It also speaks of the threat to civilians, because you've got the Ukrainian tank firing high explosive rounds that miss and then go and, I mean, the two we can see explode in an area of sort of scrubby woodland. But there are buildings all around the place, and some of them are burning. So clearly something's happened before this. And also the Russian forces fire back, as you'd expect. They're under contact. They will fire back into areas of likely firing positions. And they themselves, those rounds going to land somewhere, and there's buildings all around. So it just speaks of how dangerous it is for civilians to be in these areas, and how it's just we've got to get this thing stopped as soon as possible, because you start flinging heavy metal around, then the wrong people are going to get hit.
Thank you very much, Dom. I think you answered every question I had before I even said it. So thank you. That was absolutely fascinating, and it was really good to get your take on some of the visuals we're getting out of this conflict. I don't know if before we go to questions from the listeners, I don't know if Theo or Francis want to come in on any of that.
I would just add, it is extraordinary footage, and Dom's summed it up and analyses it masterfully in the article, so I would highly recommend that people read it. Just one final thought on that from me. I read a fascinating piece of analysis that was talking about why Russian armour has been so bad in this conflict. We've spoken previously about how Putin idolises the tank given its significance in the Russian victory, or Soviet victory, should I say, in the Second World War. It has a huge place in the national memory in Russia. But actually, the Russian tank corps is really a sort of superficially reformed Soviet army, and as a result of that, it has several crucial deficiencies. The Soviet military, and I didn't really appreciate this, was designed for nuclear war. Namely, it was designed or that and pacifying satellite states, and those are obviously two very different things than traditional warfare that we are now seeing in Ukraine, particularly on the nuclear war point. The old vehicles that have, are the former models of the versions that we see today, were effectively designed to advance over nuclear sites that had been already attacked by nuclear warfare, so they were designed to be more effective against resisting radiation than they were bullets. And it was for this reason that when you look at footage of Afghanistan and Chechnya, quite often the soldiers are riding on the armour rather than being on the inside, because actually it was seen as not being particularly effective at resisting small arms fire. So these tanks were were designed for a different type of warfare than in the Soviet era, and these are the kind of tanks that have been inherited now that are not actually up to the standard that is required in modern day conventional warfare. And I just want to say, I thought it was an interesting point to reflect on as we consider the Russian military story of the conflict so far.
Thank you very much, Francis. So just before we finish, we've got a couple of questions from listeners. I think the first one is interesting because it speaks to some of the diplomatic updates and news we've been talking about. This is from David. He says, could I ask why Russia is still a veto member of the UN Security Council? I don't know who wants to take that one. Theo or Francis, maybe?
Yeah, it's because the only way you can chuck someone off the Permanent Security Council, there's only 5 members, Russia, China, US, UK and France. The only way you could get someone off it is if there's a Security Council vote, and obviously Russia has a veto on it, so it's not going to vote itself off. And Zelensky was addressing the UN this week and pointing out that this system is broken, that either it needs to be overhauled or ditched entirely. So that's why it's still on the Security Council, and that's why it's going to remain on the Security Council unless something really drastic happens. Though there is a vote happening today, it may already have happened as we're speaking, about voting Russia off the UN Human Rights Council, which is possible to do and has happened before in the case of Libya. So that may happen, though obviously it's nowhere near as influential or as significant as if it was removed from the Security Council.
Thank you very much, Theo. And a question I think which is aimed more at Dom. On the map, this is a question from Chris, who says, on the map, it looks like Ukraine's coastline can never be secure so long as Russian forces occupy Crimea. Do you agree?
Yeah, I've been thinking about this one. I mean, it depends what you mean by secure, which is a massively loaded term. I mean, it's a long coastline. Crimea is actually not an insignificant piece of geography. But let's think about what you need to do. So the suggestion there is that the Russian Black Sea fleet could be sunk, and Ukraine could fire off some missiles. Entirely possible. Yeah, of course, there's anti-ship missiles. There are some reports that the British Harpoon anti-ship missile has been sent to Ukraine. I think that has been discounted. So if you see that around social media, I think that's largely discredited. I mean, it'd be very interesting if that is the case, but I've not seen anything to verify that. But yeah, of course, there are anti-ship missiles. Ships are incredible military platforms, so to be able to knock one of those out, or to threaten it such that it stays well out the way of a combat zone, then terrific. But let's think about how you do that. Before you hit something, and by hitting it, you've got the missile's got to work properly. It's got to guide properly. It's got to get to the right place. It's got to have enough fuel. It's got to have enough explosive that it can do some damage when it gets there. But that explosive can't be so heavy that it can't fly more than 10 meters. All these kind of things. But let's say you can hit something. To be able to hit something, you've got to see something. So you've then got to have eyes either on the water, under the water, on land, in the air, satellite. You've got to have some kind of something that's capable of seeing a target, seeing a Russian ship, and then working out exactly where it is in terms of coordinates, being able to literally know where it is on the map and communicate that back down to the missile. And then before you do that, before you can actually see something, you've got to be watching. You've got to be watching everywhere. I mean, it's a big old coastline, and to have this. So what you need is an entire surveillance network covering all aspects of that coastline, with such military word coming up, such granularity, such detail, to be able to see where ships are. You've got to be watching the whole time, and then when you see something, you've got to be able to zone in and get the coordinates, and then you've got to be able to pass those coordinates to a missile battery that can do something about it. So what I'm suggesting is that whole system, which is entirely possible, I mean, that's basically an air defense system, it's an Antiship system. It's what a soldier does when he looks out of his turret and sort of scans the ground in front of him or her. I mean, but that surveillance system is very, very complex and sophisticated, and therefore expensive. So it is entirely possible for Ukraine to have a fully swept up, knitted together system whereby it can threaten the Black Sea Fleet, but it would probably break the bank to do it. And at what cost? If you do that, are you able to defend the skies elsewhere in the country? Are you able to buy lots of rifles, good rifles, or do you go for the second most cheapest option? Never forget that your weapon has been supplied by the lowest bidder, was another great military expression. How we joked. But yeah, so these things are very, very expensive, these systems. So yes, a long answer to a short question. It is possible, but it's very, very expensive and probably beyond the military sophistication for what Ukraine can afford right now, or has been able to afford up to now, because it just wouldn't have been able to do anything else. I hope that helps. If it doesn't, please do. Let's carry on the chat. Get a hold of me in the usual ways, and we'll carry this on. But yeah, that'll be my view.
Thank you very much, Dom, and thank you, David and Chris, for sending in those questions. And if you do have questions to our experts, please email us as well, podcast@telegraph.co.uk. Can I get Theo, Francis and Dom, just quickly, your final thoughts of things to look for the rest of the day in the next few days?
I think the rest of the day in the next few days, as I said before, it's going to be what is coming out of these previously Russia-occupied areas, and we get a real sense of what has been happening there the last few weeks, while there has been this information blackout, and these reports will go towards prosecuting whoever needs to be prosecuted for war crimes, and getting a real sense of what this war has been for civilians on the ground.
My final thought is just picking up on something that Theo said earlier on when we were talking about the United Nations veto, sort of the Security Council. It's very interesting that since its conception in 1946, it has been used, the veto, as quite a considerable weapon by, I mean, you could say all five powers for various different reasons, but particularly by Russia, or the Soviet Union as it was then. So the veto has been used 293 times in its history. Russia/the USSR have used that, of those, 120 times. The UK has only used it 29 times. So I just thought that was quite revealing, and speaks to the challenges posed by David with his question, that it is very difficult to change the geopolitical landscape as long as, and to punish nations like Russia that are committing these atrocities in ways that would be seen as effective and being and unified, as long as this veto exists. But whether we will see changes to that, I think is unlikely. But certainly it's interesting, isn't it, that the ground does seem to be shifting on this, and a lot of interesting backroom conversations are happening and are taking place as we speak. And so I would just watch this space. That would be something for thinking very, very long term, that perhaps we may well see some changes to the UN Security Council long term, because clearly in its current incarnation, one could argue that it is not operating as effectively as perhaps it should be in these situations.
Thanks, Francis. And Dom Nichols, would you like the final words?
Yeah, thanks. I'd say keep your eyes on the Donbass. A sudden Russian push there in the next few days, I would suggest, would not speak of a nimble, agile military with unity of command. I think that would speak of panic, for all the reasons that we've said earlier on. And perversely, I think the Ukrainians would welcome an early fight in the Donbass region.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 30 days completely free at telegraph.co.uk/audio. Or sign up to Dispatches, our daily Ukraine newsletter, which brings stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so that you don't miss it. If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave a review, as it helps others find the show. You can also get in touch directly with us by emailing podcasts@telegraph.co.uk. We do read every message. Ukraine the Latest is produced by Louisa Wells and Giles Gear, and on Twitter, Sophie Coe.